Welcome to Phenomenal Conversation number 28 with Curtis Ogden on the regenerative flow in systems. And Phenomenal Conversations are trying to co-create and contribute to regenerative cultures, of which is a theme to which Curtis has spent quite a long time studying in both individual, collective, and systemic ways. So given everybody else has introduced themselves, Curtis, would you like to say something about how you've got into this intersection with systems change and regenerative work?
Sure, and thanks again for the invitation to be a part of this and to be in conversation, not just you and I, but with the entire group. How did I get into this? That's a good question. I feel like my understanding of that is constantly evolving as I become more aware of certain things and certain forces and energies in the world. On the one hand, you might say that I stumbled into it. On the other hand, maybe I was born for this. I'm not quite sure, something in between. But I know that in a sense, I've always been interested in flow and energy and had, I think, like all of us, an intuitive sense of when we are lively, enlivened, and when we're not. And I've always been interested in large-scale change for as long as I can remember, just feeling that that was what I was here to support. Although what that means and what that looks like has also been evolving. So the intersections of that, I would say I was getting sort of intellectually from just the work that I've done now for a few decades, supporting networks for social change as a process designer, facilitator, trainer, coach, and ongoing consultant. And something that sort of intuitively started coming up for me around that work was there were a lot of people talking about systems in a way that felt like we were distancing ourselves from those systems, that the objectification of the system struck me as not quite right and not entirely helpful. And of course, there are systems thinkers who have said as much, that if we don't see how we are part of the problem, it's hard to be part of the solution. Or to put it maybe without so much value judgment, if we don't see our role in this dynamic flow, then it's hard to really work with it. We're not just standing on the shores of the river, we're in it. We're swimming with the flows and the tides. And so as I was doing a lot of work around network building and network weaving, just for some background, over the last 15 years in particular, I've supported various networks to evolve in this region called New England at the state or regional level, focused on food systems, working on a watershed group actually in the Connecticut River Valley that made me wonder, Nicole, of whether a future conversation is in order here. Working in place-based networks focused on racial justice and social change, and started to come to this sense that we don't simply build networks so that we can work on something. The networks are already there. Systems are networks and networks are systems. And there's something about the working with connection and flow within those systems that just started more intuitively coming up as that's the work. We're in the systems and we're working not just with these physical structures, but these flows that actually become systems, right? With boundaries that we project on them and may exist by some of their laws of nature, but that's how I got into it.
Well, one of the things that I think is unique that I know about you is this focus on energy systems science and the work of Sally Gerner. Could you explain and introduce that work and how it intersects with what you're doing so that everybody in the room has got a sense of where that's coming from and what it's about?
Yes. So Dr. Gerner, Dr. Sally Gerner, who now lives in Chicago, she's semi-retired, a grandmother who's also playing her grandmotherly roles there. She has long time been a transdisciplinary scientist, working in the Research Triangle in North Carolina. She's been on the tech side of things, and she got a PhD in psychology as well. And so she wrote a book a number of years ago that somehow I found, and it was at this time where I was saying to myself, networks are not a so that, they're an as, they're an is. We don't build this for that. It's all woven together, and I didn't have the language for it quite. And then I picked up Dr. Gerner, a book she wrote with a couple of other colleagues called The New Science of Sustainability. And its whole treatise it's basically focused on this idea that everything is energy and it's moving at different vibrations. We as humans tend to have a bias towards the slower moving vibrations that look like they're in physical form as opposed to those we can't see or sense. But I would argue we can see and sense them. We just have to become more sensitive. And she was writing about flow networks as really being what we're talking about when we talk about systems. Systems have structures, but fundamentally, these structures are supporting the ongoing regenerative flow of whatever nutrients, literal or metaphorical, are important to that system in question. So that could be nutrients, it could be ideas, it could be money, it could be other kinds of goods and services, but whatever it is that nourishes the whole body, that is what we're focused on in this new science of sustainability. We're trying to get out of being overly materialist, but without rejecting materialism, saying that the dynamism of flow and exchange should be of greater interest than it is right now.
And so I think that what I'm hearing, and maybe you can clarify or elucidate, is this breadth of system science. It encompasses a lot more than system science might traditionally have been preoccupied with. Am I right in saying that?
I would say that, yes, and maybe as I understood, as I've been told the story by some mentors, and there's always a story, and I'm open to other stories, but that system science, much as it had been put out there into the world, academically anyway, came from mainly men and white men, and also white men who were more inclined towards the fields of mechanical engineering. And so this is not to malign white men, of which I am one, or mechanical engineering, but to say that is a particular way of looking at the world, absent other ways of looking at the world. So mechanical, structural, not as much as looking at the dynamic flow, masculine as opposed to the feminine. Mm. So my most important mentors, either I would say are women or embody that sort of feminine balancing of what I think is more of a traditionally male mechanistic approach to systems and systems thinking.
Okay, well, I think that's very clear. I'm wondering if you could illustrate an example of a system you're working in where you're using this approach to sort of give us a more tangible sense of how this is manifesting in and through your work. So we can...
Yeah, I'll give you a very personal example. I'm going to talk about me as a system.
You as a system, okay.
Yeah. I've learned a tremendous amount over the last 7 years ago through an intense healing process I've been going through for things that I knew I went through as a child, things I didn't know I'd gone through as a child, as it turns out. And also through everything I've gone through growing up in a place like Flint, Michigan, which was a challenging, failing industrial town to grow up in, which was lots of class issues, race issues, and then growing up in American culture, which I was talking with somebody earlier this morning, and we were agreeing that, American mainstream culture is profoundly dissociative. And so if you grow up being touched by it, guess what happens? So, there was a lot to work through. It was more intensely touched off by just as COVID was beginning, which of course was something else, sort of a shock to our systems. They discovered I had a benign tumor on my left acoustic nerve. Thank God, benign. It was treated with radiation, dominant medical system, zapped it, said, our job is done. But what ended up happening is my whole system had a reaction to that intervention. And so I've been meeting with so many different healers over the last 4 years. I mean, probably 20 different healers, maybe representing 15 different kinds of approaches beyond the tradition, the mainstream Western. And this has included energy healers, acupuncturists, acupressurists, biomagnetic practitioners, people who do other forms of subtle body work, fascial work. And here I've been writing about energy system science and talking about the pillars that Sally Gerner and I both focus on. And suddenly they were right there in my face. I'm starting to understand that my structure was disconnected. Certain parts of my body were not as connected as they could have, should have been. That was inhibiting certain kinds of regenerative flows that were key to my underlying sense of health and well-being. That this other pillar of collaborative learning, there's a way in which my body as an intention and as a very intelligent system wasn't learning because it wasn't connected to certain parts of itself. And the physical, the social, the psychological, the emotional all needed to be rewoven, and the spiritual. And so by tending to creating more of a resilient, balanced structure, paying attention to what was flowing, what wasn't flowing, supporting my own learning and sort of inner collaboration in collaboration with healers was the most profound teaching for me. Because it's not intellectualized, it is profoundly embodied and humbling. So yeah, and I can offer other examples that kind of zoom out to small groups that I'm working with, including my own family, where there's sort of a healing process going on, and these various networks and communities I support. But I'll pause there.
Okay, well, maybe I'll remind you about that a little later. You mentioned Sally Gerner's four pillars. Could you explain for people listening what these four pillars are and why they're important?
Yeah, so as we say, referencing Buckminster Fuller, every boundary is a useful bit of fiction. Here, what we're lifting up are four categories, areas of focus that we feel like, in light of the whole being so overwhelming, that if we break it down, it makes it easier to work with. And if we uphold this question of what is it that maintains the long-term vitality of the system in question, whether our own bodies, a community, an ecosystem, an economy, it really comes down to these four domains. And they may evolve, they may change, but right now, the first domain is regenerative, revitalizing flows. It's when we put on that lens, that pillar, we're asking what's flowing, what's not, what does the system need, how are its outflows affecting other systems? So it's really looking at that domain of flow. The second domain or pillar is resilient and balanced structure. So that structure could be our skeletal system. It could be working agreements and governance structures for a group or an institution. It could be a system of banks, large, medium, and small in the banking system. So that's the structure that is there to facilitate, ideally, the regenerative flows. And then we talk about these two domains that are, particularly apt in the human, but I guess we could say also now more than human realm as we discover more and more. But one is this idea that we have to have a felt sense of we're all in this together. And so we call that common cause, or a fundamental sense of mutualism. That if we don't embrace, then the application of structure and flow will be too small, or probably other, or leave something out. And then the fourth domain is learning. It's how we as a species have evolved over time, pooling information, testing out hypotheses, learning from that, pooling our knowledge, innovating, experimenting, and adjusting as we go. So those are the four. And they seem pretty comprehensive as I've been taking this out into different concrete applications. I was mentioning to Dave this work we're doing in the Central Valley of California to support a regenerative initiative that is about regenerative energy, solar energy, being brought into disenfranchised communities, farm worker communities, with the idea that there must be economic return to those communities, that it cannot be extracted. You can have solar energy creating renewable energy, but there's not renewable profit for the community, that has to be woven in. And there's healing and that level of work that needs to happen as well, another form of sort of regenerative circulation that needs to be supported. So I'm definitely going down a rabbit hole now, so I'm going to stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was reasonable. You didn't disappear too far.
Okay.
That was a reasonable example. You talked about well-being and wellness. Could you explain a little bit more about how those four pillars contribute to wellness? Because we're very much, I think Cease was just mentioning about the kind of external view of systems and having a superficial view, but often we're not very cognizant of what makes a system healthy and helps it thrive and flourish. So, well-being, I think, is an important part of your work. So could you extend the framing, as it were, into that field?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting and timely question, because I've been working on working with partners at the Full Frame Initiative here in the U.S., which is it was born in this region actually of Western Massachusetts, but now it's become a national and increasingly international network, and it has looked at these 5 core domains of well-being that are structurally and systemically determined. And I should say we're also exploring how this concept of well-being could apply to the more than human realm, to waters, to forests, et cetera. But as it's been researched in terms of its core determinants of sort of socialized well-being, there are things like you've got to have some sense of stability. You've got to have some sense of mastery. Connectivity is another core determinant. There are 5 of them. And you can correlate how those different dimensions of well-being do align with this idea that you have to have some kind of structural stability, that balanced and resilient structure in your own body and the systems around you, that we have to have that sense of ongoing circulation in our own bodies, of the breath, of blood, of all the core fluids that we need to have moving in our system, but there also needs to be a circulation around us of key resources and supports coming to us. And that, that we know that everything is changing around us. So we have to be in learning mode, or we're quickly not really relevant to context anymore. And that's not a recipe for well-being. And then, that idea that we are in this together. I mean, I think that is probably more readily understood in a social context, although I applied it to my internal systems. But that if we don't feel like we're in it together, then othering ensues, instruments to isolate members of community, and that's not healthy. That doesn't contribute to well-being of those people or the whole.
Well, that is really interesting. I had a follow-up question based on common cause, because you're talking about just then about giving people some reason or meaning to work together. And these days of like hyper emphasis on diversity, which I'm not against, I think it's really important, but forging common cause and finding something that kind of energizes everybody to join in and contribute. How have you, I mean, you're working in systems, how have you gone about constellating common cause to people to kind of put differences aside and work on the kind of superordinate goal, as it were, or the main mission or the deeper purpose?
It's a great question. And it is, yeah, something that feels like it's the central question in these times. I mean, in this country where so much seems to want to fracture and where people are more focused on differences, it seems, than in what holds us together. And understanding that that happens in part to make visible what has long been invisible in terms of
Yeah.
who isn't thought of, right? There can be an obfuscation of what is unjust through this laying on of saying, hey, we're all the same, right? My father actually used to sit on the board of this metaphysical group. And my dad, being my dad, somebody came to him and he was, I can't remember what he was talking about, but it's some social injustice. And somebody said, John, don't you know that we're all one? And he got furious. He said, well, we can be one, but we're not experiencing the wonder of the oneness equitably, right? I mean, some people are clearly being mistreated and left out of this. So all of that to say that diversity and difference are important. So I don't know that we set it aside completely for the sake of not losing sight of any potential injustices, but also what makes life so sweet, which is the diversity.
Mm.
And I have an elder, an indigenous elder in my head every day, Jake Swamp, who was with the Haudenosaunee. He said, in the end, it's all meant to work together. It's all meant to work together. So I think that that is kind of the guiding question: is if it's all meant if it's all meant to work together, toward what end? And I think the longer groups are able to sit with that in an air of trust and respect, even if we don't totally agree, the more likely those more powerful, emergent, and galvanizing answers will come in.
So there's something about holding that purpose beyond rupture, or as a priority over rupturing and splintering, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, I guess splintering and rupture feels like it's part of the natural process, right? No
Yeah.
system exists forever. There's an energetic release at a certain point, or the system becomes overly rigid and brittle. And so in energy system science, we often invoke the adaptive cycle, right? Which says that systems can come into a point of growth and conservation of energy, and then they can become too big and rigid for fit in the context. And so most natural systems know you release energy, right? There's a forest fire. That's not a bad thing
Mm.
if it clears out the area. This is what indigenous burns were always about, right? To clear out space within forest for new growth, for forest succession to happen, and for fauna to roam, which is part of the biodiverse enrichment of that ecology, that ecosystem. So the ruptures are not surprising and are needed. It's just, I think, how they're interpreted. So what I like about energy system science is it depersonalizes this story a little bit, and it says the systems couldn't have continued the way they were.
Mm.
Nature says they couldn't. And furthermore, and many of them are so vastly unjust, they were going to, teeter under the weight of the top getting fat at the expense of everybody else. So yes, it's gonna unravel, but stop taking it so damn personally,
Mm.
right? We have to understand that that some of that's natural order. Now, it's certainly aided and abetted by people who do not have our best interests in mind. And that's where we need to call a spade, as they say. So anyway, I think I answered your question.
Yeah, and I was just curious a little bit that I think Karina brought in about other species. So, and I'm conscious that in terms of often my own functioning, I'm less conscious of other species and other voices and nature as a part of the whole picture. And I think that that is some of the desire for systemic change, is to bring in all dimensions and be inclusive, not exclusive or dissociated, as you said earlier. So, what does energy systems science relate to or talk about other species and their participation and coexistence in healthy systems?
Well, from the standpoint that everything is energy, they're included, right? They're just in different forms.
Yeah.
And I think, there's very much a respect for indigenous perspectives or perspectives that would choose to see, energy in its different forms that we have to deeply respect and actually be in relationship with. And so, concretely, what that's looking like, with some of this water protectors work that I'm doing is engaging with indigenous perspectives that are a little more advanced in terms of knowing how to be in relationship with, communicate with all our kin, which, for some people really steeped in Western science, they feel like it's just complete bullshit. I'll just put it that way. But it's the longer standing way of knowing for our species and very widespread. And it's not a question of either or. It's a question of, bringing these different ways of knowing together and being in conversation with each other. So, we're talking about in the Connecticut River Watershed Partnership, how can we develop more of a sense of relatedness to the river itself?
Yeah.
We heard a beautiful talk a couple Fridays ago from Kari Castango, who's the first known human being to swim the length of the Connecticut River, 410 miles done over a number of years. And she just told how being in the waters that length of time changed her. She says the river is still in her. She learned to read it, be in conversation with it. She had to do that for her own survival. In certain instances, swimming between hurricanes, for example, when there was considerable turbulence, but also just became more part of her daily observation of how the birds were and what would do, their behaviors, other animals. So I'm pretty convinced they're talking to us all the time. We're just not listening or don't know how to.
So I think that brings us, I think I can round things off by just, you've mentioned indigenous people's wisdom and their relationship and knowledge of the land. So often I think I've heard you mention that this kind of energy system science almost awakens us to reacquaint or remember these ancient forms of knowing that actually are already in existence. So could you talk about some of your experience of that and what that perspective brings into cultivating healthy systemic health?
Oh my, yeah. I mean, some of it's hard to put into words. So last year, I co-designed and co-facilitated a gathering of indigenous land protectors and Western conservation scientists from all over the globe. We met in Buffalo, New York, which happened to be my birthplace, and on the land of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy being one of the oldest, known democracies that we know that the founders of this country learned from in their creation of the democracy we know as the United States, or so-called. And it was not your ordinary convening. We began with the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, which is profound. If you've never had a chance to hear it, they call it the words that come before all others. And it takes us back to the original instructions that were given to the Haudenosaunee. And if you're listening, if you're really listening, there's a lot in there that just felt like it was already beginning to attune me in a different way to the people around me and the natural systems. We did a morning tobacco ritual on the shores of Lake Erie. I can't, again, I can't explain it fully, but the deeper sense of connection and relatedness was just continuously evolving through that time, both to some of these indigenous brothers and sisters and to the landscape around us. And that's just continued through various other conversations, ceremonial participation. Yeah, there's just a different way of sort of listening and orienting that I just feel on a daily basis. What jumps out at me, what I hear, what I see, what I'm thinking about, what catches my attention.
And how did that relate to the symposium, or was it the rituals you did, or the gathering wisdom?
Yeah, it's just say that there was a Seneca dance done. We did a sort of formal acknowledgement of the hurts and harms that have been caused by conservation science. We did a lot that I think got to a certain level of depth that that a lot of us carried forward from that and continue to seek out in different settings. That somehow doing the work, the quote unquote work without that, to me feels a little superficial.
Okay, so I get it, I think, and this sort of relates a little bit to what Cease was saying in the beginning around there's kind of superficial and changing and engineering, and then there's this deeper connection that we all carry. And it sounds like some of the kind of core structures of you and the others were affected by coming together and meeting in this way. I would sort of say partly because it was ceremonial and sacred, which is shut out of most ways of looking at systemic change, I would say.
Yeah, actually, as you say that, you know that I quote her often, but I had a chance to meet Gay Hohuako Norma Jacobs, who's a Haudenosaunee elder who I've developed a relationship with since. And it was interesting how in our meeting, I'm just saying the energies are always interesting, right? That when I met her, she was talking to some people about how the Ogden Land Company had taken land from her people. Well, that's my people, the Ogden people, right? And so she writes a lot about the reconciliation of the settlers and those who were colonized here. And so it was just very interesting. I mean, it led to, that's a story for another time, but yeah, I've done some reparations work on behalf of my family. Some of it more symbolic than substantive at this point, and I hope I can do more going forward. But that's all backstory, just to say that, my meeting with her was pretty special, and she has held space for us and some of the food systems work that we're doing. And when you listen to her, it's just, yeah, you're in ceremony. And what she says is that where we put ourselves back together is in ceremony.
Yeah.
She will often say, that's how we put ourselves back together. And I take that to mean our individual healing and our social healing and our healing with our more than human kin that we've ignored for a long time.
Gorgeous. I think we'll end the recording there, and then I'll just speak to everybody a little bit.